Hi, Sam here. Happy to be joined again by Mark and Emma. It's been a little while. There's been quite a few things happening. Well, my summer hasn't been quite as
Hmm.
exciting as theirs, but I'll let them tell you about it. Why don't you start, Mark?
Okay. So, if it's not apparent in my face, having aged or not, I know there's some grays coming in more, and my beard is definitely scragglier than usual. We welcomed the second child of the Ferreira family, little Elijah Zachary, and he is absolutely adorable and chubby, and having no problems, and which is really good so far, especially because he was born 6 weeks early. Uh,
Oh yeah.
he was stuck in the NICU for 5 days. Hospital policy can't let him go till they're 35 weeks cooked. Um, but he was in a lot better shape than a lot of the babies in there, which was, both a blessing and a little bit upsetting when you see some of them in there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um, but yeah, that's my major update. That's why it's probably one of the reasons it's taken so long to get here.
yeah.
Yeah. Congratulations.
Yes, congrats. Yeah, my wife
Um
works labor and delivery, and yeah, it could be hard sometimes for sure. But yeah, I'm glad that you were blessed with a healthy child, and I assume mom's doing well with the recovery.
Oh yeah, a lot better because it wasn't a cesarean.
Yeah,
oh yeah.
right.
Yeah, and I moved houses. Um that was that was kind of the biggest thing of this spring and summer. So I also delayed things between moving houses and finishing a pretty tough semester in grad school. So I've been enjoying having a little bit of downtime after that.
Excellent. Yeah, yeah. As for the reading today, so gosh, you really have to give it to Ratzinger. He really pulls out a lot of content from pretty pretty small amount of words. So, uh, yeah, I mean, the sections we went through before were dealing more with Credo or the first part of the Apostles' Creed, I believe. And in this section, he's talking about God the Father. Well, let me make sure I get this right here. So I've got it up here. So, yeah, God the Father, Almighty Maker of heaven and earth. So, yeah, about halfway through the book, and he's gotten through the first line, really. So, it's yeah, no, it's I guess both a curse and a blessing sometimes of reading sort of more academic works that he's really
Reading
goes deep
Germans.
on this stuff. Yeah, yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
in
So,
Germans.
yeah,
Yeah,
no,
this
there
one was
definitely were
dense.
some sections where I was looking at it and I was like, okay, where does this sentence begin and end?
I definitely
So,
had to go back over some of them.
yeah. So as I read it, he kind of ties together two ideas. He refers to the God of the philosophers and the God of religion. And the idea seems to be that the Father and Almighty brings together both of those concepts in the creed. So you have the
Mhm.
personal God, or the God who's part of history, and then you also have God as Logos, or God as Almighty. Uh, and yeah, I'll read a section here that where he talks about Pascal and his encounter with God. And Pascal is sort of a key figure in this because I think he sort of represents both the idea of God as logic, or God as logos, and then the idea of God as agape, or God as fire, as it is referred to in this section. So, this godhood previously existed as something neutral, as a highest culminating concept. This godhood had been understood as pure being or pure thought circling around forever, closed in upon itself without reaching over to man and his little world. This God of the philosophers, whose pure eternity and unchangeability had excluded any relation with the changeable and transitory, now appeared to the eye of faith as the God of men, who is not only thought of all thoughts, the eternal mathematics of the universe, but also agape, the power of creative love. In this sense, there does exist in the Christian faith what Pascal experienced on the night when he wrote on a slip of paper that he henceforth kept sewn in the lining of his jacket. The words fire, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not of the philosophers and scholars. He had encountered the burning bush experience, as opposed to a God sinking back completely into the realm of mathematics, and had realized that the God who is the eternal geometry of the universe can only be this because he is creative love, because he is the burning bush from which a name issues forth, through which he enters the world of man.
I mean, that really encapsulates a lot of it, right?
Yeah.
To append to that, and almost kind of what Ratzinger talks about a lot, is I'm going to relate an anecdote that happened about a week before Easter, where I was in the grocery store near my house getting some stuff, and two of the check-in clerks, or like check clerks, were basically debating whether there was a God or not because Easter was coming up. And one of them says, I'm kind of convinced there's a supreme being, but he doesn't care about us, right? And I'm like, oh, buddy, maybe you should think about that a little more, because I'd read this pretty recently. I've read this section multiple times. And I'm like, I don't want to get into this. It's late at night. I got to get home. I said I was just grabbing a few things. But man, I think that's what a lot of people go with, and then have they don't trip over the fact that, okay, so he's a supreme being, but he's also self-centered. Really? Does that make sense? I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting how easily people will assume that he doesn't care about us. Like, that seems like the default option, and you have to prove that he does.
Right? I mean, obviously the Greeks thought so. The philosophers. I mean, that's part of what is the difference that Ratzinger gets into, right? Is that the difference between God as thought, pure thought, versus God as love.
Right, but for the Greeks, that was preferable to their gods who were involved in their lives, because their gods were capricious and petty.
Oh yeah, they were all too human, right? They were just humans with more power.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess it jumps ahead a little bit, but does the idea of the supreme being or God as being make sense outside of the idea of God as relationality on some level? So.
I mean, that's part of the book that I found very difficult to parse, is when Ratzinger puts relatio and substance on the same level, whereas like it's a fundamental essence, like a fundamental part of reality, if that is what God is, and I don't know how to parse that. Right? Maybe I don't know. Maybe Emma does. Maybe there's a Thomist out there who does. But man,
I had to read that part like 3 times just to figure out what he was saying.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's something where my spatial intelligence is like negative. Like I try and I don't know, when I've taken science classes, it just on some level it just doesn't compute in my mind, and I'm sitting here and I'm like looking at like images or visualizations of wave versus particle theory, like trying to wrap my head around it. And yeah, I mean, but there's a kind of, well, we'll get to it a little bit later on, but I mean, he does, I think, get at the sort of like the mind-blowing kind of nature of the idea of God as, well, relatio, or God is both Father and Son simultaneously. So, but I guess in this first section, though, how would you sort of define the God of religion versus the God of philosophers? I have my ideas about it, but I want to hear more from the two of you on this one.
Emma, you want to go first? Or do you want to hear me and then bounce off that?
I think I want to hear you and then bounce off that.
So I think for me, it is that thought versus love, and that the God of the philosophers is uncaring. He is geometry. He is unity, but unity without desire, where the God of the Bible pursues man, right? He is coming after us in his infiniteness, and that we are ultimately the most important thing to him, where the God of philosophers could care less. He is more consumed with thinking about himself, right? That is ultimately what he is, and we are just byproducts.
Yeah. So I guess I had a question in my mind in reading this, and he sort of hints at it but doesn't go at it explicitly, which is, so is the God of the Bible the God of the philosophers or the God of religion? And religion in this context means popular piety, I think is the way you could say it. So, like festivals, mythologies, things like that. And the answer seems to be yes, right? I mean, he seems to say that the God of the Bible has both elements there, where because I mean, one sort of, I guess, heresy could be the kind of heresy where the gods they're almost like Marvel characters, right? They're people, but they just have more power, more capability. And then another heresy could be the God is not present in the world. And I guess I was thinking about it. I don't want to call out a specific people, but it does seem like there was kind of maybe some flirting with, or so usually the second heresy is more common. The idea, with the person at the checkout, the idea that God's not part of the world. But I do think there's actually, interestingly, been some flirting with the first heresy in this little corner recently. The idea of God as, well, I'll just say it, and people can figure it out, something less than perfect. So, but so, and but I mean, I think you have to have both elements. You have to have the idea of the logos and the agape. I mean, and you don't have the full conception of God without both elements.
Well, and it really is so hard for us to conceive of perfect love.
Yeah.
Just as human, well, because everything you can compare it to is going to be imperfect in some way. And so I think that makes it much easier to fall into, like, when you're thinking of God more as a person and more as relational, I think it is easier to sort of fall into thinking of him as like imperfect or as too human. And it's that sort of tension, because you don't want to like make him really distant, but you don't want to make him really human either.
Yeah, I mean the perfect love is hard to conceive of. I mean, I was musing on this a little bit ago, reading one of those awful stories, some murder that happened, and I realized that when all this happens, I always pray for who died or who's victims, but I very rarely pray for the murderer. Very like I take some deep effort on my part, if any, and I can barely get over just an unrequited desire for vicious justice, right? Where one God is talking, in Isaiah, though your sins be scarlet, they shall be white as snow, right? Like I can't conceive of that on a human level. I find that impossible to actually approach. But he has to be that way.
Mhm.
Not just because the Bible says so, but because he is fully actualized. There is no imperfection.
Yeah. Yeah, it is fascinating. I think of Revelations, right? I stand at the door and knock, and um, it's something where I'll go off on a little bit of a tangent that might lose Emma for a second, but I know there's a guy, Charlie Cook, who's associated with National Review, that Mark and I both will listen to his podcasts and things. And it's fascinating because I was listening to it, and he had made a comment, something about the fact that when he was a child, he just had like heard something about God, and he and he clearly doesn't think that God is illogical. I mean, he works well. His spouse is Catholic, as I understand it, and he works for a publication that is, I guess you could say, maybe nominally Catholic, or at least Catholic
Crypto Catholic.
associated. Yeah, crypto Catholic's a good word for it. But I thought about that, and like I remember being a kid and like having this idea in my head, and it's not that my family was especially spiritual, but this thought of where was I before I was born, and this concept that there was something um, about me. I mean, I guess you could say the idea of a soul is, I don't know, like David Brooks might define it, something that's immeasurable and not physical substance. And I don't know, it's interesting where, I mean, you really, on some level, these things are in your bones, right? I mean, you'd like to think that, I mean, arguments can make a difference, but I mean, you also have the fire, right? I mean, at least in Christianity, yeah, God is both the logos and the fire. And, well, I guess I say logos, but he also, one of the things Ratzinger talks about is logos as noun and logos as verb. So around sort of the end of the section.
I wanted to touch on actually something you said there about the conception of God as being young. I mean, I touched on it before, where for me I dismissed it pretty quickly as a child, being grown up on Bill Zion's Science Guy sort of stuff. But what's interesting for me is watching my youngest son, I guess, start to get it a little bit or understand, and it's been a great struggle because he currently doesn't want to have books read to him. He hits them out of my hand. But
You're ready to Philistine.
Yeah, there you go. But when I went to mass with him, and he was being a little 2-year-old, and at the end of it, one of the ladies come up and is like, you did so well, good job. And he's like, who are we here for? And he goes, Jesus. Oh. And I said, who's God? And then he points to the crucifix. I was like, huh.
Yeah.
I wonder how that's forming in his mind.
Yeah.
And I don't know what that means, because a lot of the stuff that I've wanted to do with him, I think is going to have to happen later as he gets a little less angry, like 2-year-old anger. Like he doesn't want to pray, he doesn't want to do any of that, right? But some of it is getting through. Some of it, and that's the interesting part to me that you touched on there, the early conception.
Yeah, I mean, it is a strange kind of relationship between the idea of articulation versus the idea of belief. Because, I mean, on some level, I think all three of us would say, oh, yeah, I believe. And, I mean, I think we would say, yeah, we like the creed. But at the same time, I mean, we're reading a 400-page book by an academic, and we're having discussions and taking notes and all this stuff to understand it better. So, I mean, there's this process where articulation has different levels, and I mean, at some point, it's you say, well, if you ask, what do you mean when I believe it? It has deeper and lesser meanings, and you think, and I mean, God obviously, I mean, he calls us to the faith of the child, right? To the, but he doesn't only call us to the faith of a child, too. So.
No, I think that's right.
Yeah.
Like,
and I think that's the beautiful part about the creeds is that they admit of all these different levels.
I mean, it goes into what Ratzinger talks about, right? The growing gap that happened between piety and philosophy, where the stronger, like the more people thought about it, or at least philosophers thought about it, the gap just grew too large between popular custom and what they thought they discovered through philosophy, which meant that all those beliefs couldn't be true. So they had to come up with 3 different systems to try to reconcile that. It's just going to be a noble lie that we can't tell the people, or else they're going to, revolt. Can we just interpret it away to be nothing but fables, and so on and so forth. But of course, once you do that, like Ratzinger says, anything that has to survive through interpretation is no longer alive. It's dead.
Yeah.
Right? It's already dead.
Yeah. The term he uses that I have in my notes about philosophy is an academic extra-religious reality.
Academic extra-religious reality.
Yeah. So, and I mean, it's interesting because we still see that divide, right, to some extent. I mean, it's very, well, I mean, you see it playing out with Jordan Peterson, for example, right? I mean, he seems to not have any issues with the idea of God as, well, logos, but I mean, he seems to, well, I don't want to put words in his mouth, and I don't know, he's a little bit like PVK in that he talks a lot but sometimes reveals little in some ways. but he seems to have trouble with the idea of God as agape, though, or the power of creative love with that part of it.
Or anything existing outside the human mind.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you might think it's fundamental to the way that we operate, but I'm not sure that he would sign on to that. Absent us, it exists. Right?
Yeah.
It's mind independent.
Huh.
I think he's also been through a lot in the past couple years, and maybe what he said 2 years ago would not necessarily reflect what he thinks now. I don't know.
That's true. I mean, I definitely started more at his position and slowly have been dragged towards a more very much not that position. Which is the interesting part to me, is that I think the deeper you go, the more real it can actually become. Yeah. And in that way, it's actually, the faith is a reconciliation really between popular piety and philosophy, because it can accommodate both levels at the same time.
I think a lot of the time people think that divide is still there in in modern Christianity, but I don't think it actually is, or I don't think it has to be. I don't know. At the same time, it kind of makes me think of the whole, I know this is old news, but this is the last time I really watched that many videos. The whole meta-modern debate that people were talking about a month ago, 2 months ago.
Man, how fast times move. How is that old news now?
I just know that I haven't really watched any PVK videos in at least a month. So.
It's been synod. That's all it's been.
Yeah, I believe it.
Yeah, he's had a full personal schedule, so I don't think he's done a true randos video in like maybe 3 or 4 months. I want to say it's been a while.
But from what I heard with this whole like meta-modern debate, it seems to be almost reintroducing that gap.
What do you mean?
Well, I think it was. Is it like Graham Patrick Dempsey?
Yeah,
or
so
something?
Brendan Graham Dempsey.
Brendan Graham. I keep mixing him up with the Grey's Anatomy actor, and I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah, so don't get me started on his apologetics, but basically his idea seems to be that you can express spirituality through art in a lot of ways and through aesthetics without necessarily having a theology. Would you say that's accurate, Emma? Or?
From what I've seen, yeah, I didn't watch the whole video or anything, but the sense I got was that he was basically making Christianity like undisprovable, because it was like, even if you proved that this never really happened, I would still like act just the same and act as if it did, or something like that.
Yeah, so he's a seminarian, but his degree from Yale is actually a master's of art. So I guess he's done like these creative community kind of things, and he's like published a fairly lengthy like epic poem. Yeah, some of the theology though, it seemed, I don't know. It's gosh, yeah. Well, here I'll use a George Willism. He was a pyro in a field of corn, or with strawman. Pyro in a field of strawman.
Oh man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so why is that the divide, Emma?
Because if you can't convince someone, like if you couldn't be convinced through like truth or facts or logic not to believe in Christianity anymore, if that was just like, it was impossible to prove to you that Christianity wasn't true, then you really do just have this popular piety of ancient Greece and Rome where it's completely divorced from this idea of like truth and philosophy. Like you've decided not to care about it. That's at least what it seems like to me.
No, I think that's actually a really good point. Is really that would be throwing theology out the window, which is really the thing that separates it, right?
Yeah. And like it sounds weird and it sounds bad, but like if you could prove to me that Jesus is buried somewhere, I would stop being a Christian. I would have to.
Yeah, fair, tall order.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one of the convincing things about Christianity, it seems to me anyways, is that the objections to it are all in the scriptures themselves, right? And I mean, yeah, if Christ is not risen, we are to be pitied among all men, right? I mean, so, and I mean, and that, I guess I think about that, and yeah, it seems like the idea, I don't know, it seems like these things, like the more you study them or the more you really look at them, there's really, I don't know, I guess the line about Shakespeare was that there's only like 12 stories in the world and he took them all. And I mean, maybe there's only really about like 5 arguments really in the world. And maybe we keep going back and forth and cycling on them. I mean, even Ratzinger, he talks about kind of how the prophets had a similar argument as the philosophers with Israel.
Yeah, I mean, they make the same arguments, right? Ultimately, it's just they don't have the same problem that the philosophers do of being like, yeah, I still kind of want to live in this society, um, where the prophets have no problem being like, yeah, this is just gonna suck for me, isn't it? But I'm gonna say it.
Yeah.
No one wants to be Socrates.
Yeah. That's true. So, yeah, I mean, that is one of, I guess the part of the. So I guess that's an interesting point. So I think we kind of already went over some of the nuance of it, but I mean, Ratzinger says that Christianity chose the God of the philosophers, so they chose the less popular path in some ways, but it ultimately was conquering. I mean, it ultimately won out, at least over the Greek religion. So, I mean, that is an interesting component, right?
I mean, but it must be said immediately. Uh, it took on anything that it could while
Uh,
maintaining itself in its purity, right? Like
yeah.
if you Newman compares the church to Aaron's rod, devouring the serpents while remaining whole, right? It baptized whatever could be baptized.
Yeah.
I mean, the vestments priests wear, guess what? Those are back to the Roman priesthood.
Hmm.
I mean, it took over popular piety while merging with theology and correct philosophy
Hmm.
at the same
Yeah.
time.
Well, and by the time Christianity came along, philosophy had so weakened the gods of Greece and Rome that they weren't going to last long anyway.
No, you have to maintain a willing disbelief, which I feel uh, a lot of neo-pagans have. They just kind of put it to the side, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sure that's a firebomb comment to some people, but I don't know how you can maintain it and read Aquinas. Like, if you can come with a polytheistic answer and answer Aquinas, I'll listen to you. Until then, I'm not interested.
Hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, something Ratzinger doesn't really get into, but there was the gods of the mythology, but there was also the gods of the polity, right? Too. I mean, that was the sort of the cult of the strongman, if you will, was a big part of the Roman Empire too, and yeah, but yeah, but it's interesting. I mean, that was part of the scandal of Christianity, right? That excuse me, God and man was not a significant person in the Christian framework.
No, not significant, but the most significant at the same time.
Yeah.
And I think he makes the point that, unlike the God of the philosophers, the Christian God is most interested in the smallest things
Yeah.
because his attention is not limited.
Hmm.
And again, that brings back how could it be limited? He's unlimited.
Yeah.
So there'd be no point in not being interested in everything.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I had put in my notes that you mean that the idea that all heresy is to imagine a limitation on God. And I mean, we imagine limitations in both directions, right? I mean, we picture, oh, maybe God is petty, or maybe God isn't all loving. Um, I'm just going to keep saying it. Maybe God isn't perfect. But then we also imagine um, maybe God is perfect, but he's not part of the world, too. Or he's the divine mover. So, yeah. Yeah, the small things, that was a part that really jumped out to me. So, I guess maybe this is a part where the idea of God and the small things, is that something that either of you had thought about in relationship to the other readings or things you were thinking of when you had this passage out?
Hmm. I know I had to read it a few times to like even grasp what the heck was going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That like you were doing relatio and substance. This was me. Like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
I think is making more sense, right? That ultimately each spirit is more important than a galaxy, as Ratzinger says.
Hmm.
Right? Matter is ultimately dead.
Yeah. Yeah, he talks about the significance of matter. That was one of the things. I guess ultimately, is matter independent, or does it proceed from? Uh, does it proceed from something? In this case, does it proceed from God? Seems to be the kind of question. And yeah, no, yeah, I think maybe this is a good transition. I think we all were kind of struggling maybe a little bit with the second part here today. And yeah, I mean, Ratzinger, he says that the Trinity is confounding, and yeah, he doesn't seem wrong, right? I mean,
No, he's not wrong. I mean,
so,
if you want to give Sam free points here, when I read Newman's essay on the development of doctrine, I was quite shocked actually to read Sam's talking points coming out of Saint Newman's mouth, because I was like, oh my God, is the man right? Turns out he makes a good argument.
yeah.
Because wow,
Huh.
Newman did it first.
So,
Sam transfigured Sam?
yeah.
Yep.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, if you read, like I took giant notes from it, it's basically coming to the Trinity is difficult. It's not readily obvious in some ways, um, and that's part of the development thesis, right? Is
Yeah.
that's the only way forward.
Well, I think something Ratzinger does, I think any great writer or thinker does this, is he makes you look at things in a way you haven't thought about them before. And I mean, actually, even before I got to that section, I had in my mind, I mean, I and my Father are one. I mean, that really is one of the most kind of confounding kind of statements that you can think of. I mean, I mean, especially when he says Father, I mean, so he's not referring to a physical father, he's referring to the idea of God. So, but why do you say one if you distinguish between, if there's a duality? And I mean, what does it mean to, yeah, to have a conversation if you're in unity? If I mean, like, I don't know, I mean, I don't talk to my hand, right? I mean, I mean,
I hope.
I project conversation, right? I project a word. I project logos, if you will, in the direction of other people, right? So, and yeah, I mean, one of the things that Ratzinger says is that God is not just logos, but God is also dialogos.
Mhm.
So, God is not just word; God is also conversation, right? So, um, yeah. So, did the physics, was that helpful to either one of you? So, I kind of understand the concept of it, but I am borderline illiterate when it comes to science.
The wave and particle at the same time thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that it acts as one in one time and one as another. It's hard to grasp. I mean, my physics is kind of old, grade 12.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. Mine's a little fuzzy too, but I at least found it like interesting and somewhat understandable. I don't know if more understandable than other things. But I really
Yeah.
liked his idea of like we've now reached a point where we have to like look from different perspectives to get a view of the whole. just like in physics, we're not going to get the one Aristotelian, like, single sentence that sums up the whole thing.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that ultimately what's happening? The deeper we look, the more strange it gets, and things seem to break down. I mean, not break down, but like they can't be described as easily or mechanistically. The mechanistic thing got thrown out a long time ago. Then we got into relativity, and now we're something way beyond that, and people are just kind of like, I don't know what the hell's going on anymore. Which, in some ways, reassuring, because it does. I think you've seen some of these people come to some sort of faith in some way because they've seen things they can't explain anymore, and it's just they got to tie it together.
Yeah.
And how better than with something that stands above everything in so completely a weird a way.
Yeah, no, I definitely had. I mean, I guess the consensus seems to be that it was a little bit hard to grasp, but I mean, I guess for people who, I don't know, read Ratzinger and make YouTube videos about it, for not people who are in science labs. So, I mean, maybe that's part of the issue there. And, yeah, no, I definitely was kind of, maybe in some ways looking at some images actually kind of helped me a little bit to kind of think about the difference between particle and wave. So,
I did really like his comparing like God as complete actuality to, I think it was Schrodinger's like packets of waves or something like that. Like complete constant motion. I thought that was interesting.
yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess maybe to bring another, and I'm struggling with this a little here, but maybe to bring another theory into this discussion. I mean, think of the idea that God is light, right? That's, and if you, I know this is contested too, but if you believe in the idea of the Big Bang theory, the all of the energy in the universe was at one point like uh, in a space that was like the size of like maybe like a hockey puck or something like that. And you think about all that energy is containing not well every person you've ever known, every creature you've ever seen, and everything in the world. And maybe that's a good picture of the idea of God as being. And I mean, maybe it's energy, right, on some level. And I mean, yeah, it is constant motion. You look at it one way, there's one thing, but I mean, you look at it another way, there's three things, and it's something that we try and wrap our heads around, but ultimately it doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't make sense if you live in a well, if you think in a binary, right? And but
I think so. I mean, getting back to that single point, the unity, but because God is triune, the diversity is also within the unity. So it's not, diversity isn't completely breaking down of unity as the Greek philosophers thought it ultimately was and why it was bad. Where in this, it's able to reconcile it because in the diversity, there's unity because the one is three.
Well, and that's another connection to light, I guess, because white light isn't no color, it's all the colors.
Yes. Yes, it is. Until they're separated out. It's all colors at once. And black is no colors, which is a good argument for Bravasio Bono, right? Right?
True.
There you go. Black is just the absence of color. It's not a color itself. Same with evil's not a thing. It's the absence of good. Just knocking down all the old heresies here. Just boom, 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 boom.
Just line them up.
Yeah, but as as Ratzinger and Newman say, heresy is the development of doctrine, because you cannot have the doctrine refuting a heresy before the heresy happens.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I will say this. I get the sense that Ratzinger is actually very generous to the other ways of thinking about this, and he does, for one, he does bring up the idea that this is something that was contested, and that other Christians thought about it different ways. I mean, even if they were ultimately wrong in the way they were thinking about it. And and he does seem to think that maybe there's knowledge. Well, he talks about heresies as being the brick of the building, right? So, and sometimes you have to think through things to you have to maybe break down some separate components before you can build something up. So,
Yeah, I appreciated that section.
Yeah, I mean, faith isn't something plotted out on paper. It is a real living thing that goes out, interacts with minds, and then those minds interact with the world, get pushed back, and then is formulated again and again and again in a sovereignty of continuity over time. And that is ultimately what produces the theology that you and I know. Right? That's Newman, is ultimately probably what's going on. And I don't think there's any way to avoid it, in that the more of these that appear over time, the sharper the theology gets, because it's dealt with them over and over and over again. It would be nice if we would deal with new ones as opposed to all the old ones that keep coming back, because then we could have some real development.
Yeah.
As opposed to modalism again, Pelagianism again.
Yeah, some of them are very sticky.
Yeah, they are. I mean, Arianism is very sticky.
Emma, you wanted to bring Dorothy Sayers into this conversation?
Yeah, that's especially focused on the last chapter we read, the belief in the triune God. I just really like her way of thinking about it. She wrote a whole book called The Mind of the Maker, which is a meditation on the three persons of the Trinity as like three aspects of creative work, creative thinking. So you have the idea, the energy, and the power. And this whole book goes through these and thinks about it like in terms of what it means for creative work, and then what we can understand about God as the ultimate creator from these three aspects in a human writer, persons in, the great creator. And sort of cycles back and forth. Like, what does God tell us about ourselves? What does how we work tell us about God? And basically there's the idea, which is like almost like the Platonic form of the work, right? It's like when you first come up with the idea, it's not exactly fully formed, but you already know like what you want, and everything you write, you're comparing to this idea in your head to get it perfect. And then there's the energy, which I think is like the act of writing it and making it. It's the thing worked out in the world so that other people can interact with it. And then the power is kind of the reception of it, the way it works on other people. And so she compares these to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It's really hard to sum up, but it's a really interesting book, and I would like to read it with people at some point.
I think I've had more than one person recommend it. I think Mara on the writer server had brought it up at least once.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Trinity maps on to some things, and then you're always worried because, as always, there's a heresy in every analogy.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those things you can never get right. I mean,
oh yeah, and there's definitely modalism lurking in this
yeah.
one if you aren't careful working with it.
Oh, exactly. I mean, it's funny because I'm teaching a catechism class. Catechism.
Oh, good for you.
OCIA, I guess. Old RCIA is now OCIA, just to confuse people. So that's
which makes the acronym look dumber to me, but
right. But it's the Latin letters, right? As opposed to the English rendering for it.
This is the class for adult converts, correct?
Yeah. So a young gentleman from Iran is converting, and teaching him the Trinity. I've brought in a lot of this stuff that we've read, right? And some of this, and I'm like, I hope this isn't too high level. And he's like, no, seems to make sense. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, I definitely haven't gotten through.
You definitely don't get it.
No. The more you think about this, the more you're going to wonder, oh, wow, I don't get it. But like, you're bringing in all the Bishop Barron stuff. You're bringing in, a statue is being without person. We are being with person. God is being itself and is three persons. Like, yeah, sure. That looks good on a slide, but I don't think you could use it apologetically if it came up. So,
yeah, probably not.
It's got to be one of the hardest things to go through, honestly.
For sure.
And it's nice to see because he's so open and so into things that he's willing to go along with that, as opposed to being like, I don't get it. Can you do it again? We're like, well, we're going to be here a while because I'm not going to get it. And you aren't either. Just say the creed.
Yeah. Well, and it really takes time to understand something like that. And you can sometimes you can understand it without being able to articulate it, I think.
No, it's funny you say that, Mark, and part of me's thinking, is this our big takeaway from Introduction to Christianity? Just say the creed?
Just say the creed. Shut up, believe it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm joking, but on some level, that is the philosophy, right? Which is that, that Christianity is something that's received, right? And that it's... that you can have arguments and you can have theories and ideas, but at the same time, it's, Christ is Emmanuel, God with us. So, but he's also the Logos. So, right, he's also being, and it is kind of incomprehensible, the idea of something or someone who exists and on one hand, in a temporal space, but also forever, right?
Mm-hmm. And you know what? I'm going to plug my really bad Substack, where I go through.
I like your Substack.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that. What I just wrote on was kind of building on this, was things like Christianity. They aren't systems, right? The system is actually trying to explain an event, something that burst into the world and then has to be wrestled with, as opposed to it was written down on paper to be logically rational from one end to the other and coherent. No, these are things that are put together to understand something more important. And the creeds are part of that. They're a way of bringing it together in an understandable and memorable way that connects heaven and earth. But the creed wasn't made on its own, right? It wasn't, we didn't write down something. It's like, oh, that looks good. That's our religion now. No, it's, wow, this doesn't make any sense. How are we going to put this together? Which is kind of how the world really is.
Yeah, it's true. It's, No, I've been in some ways, cursed with liking some authors and thinkers who are kind of terrible people over the years. And one of them is, well, gosh, I guess I'm saying it. It's going on YouTube. One of them is Dennis Prager. And
oh, shots fired.
no, he really, well, anyways, but one of the things I remember him saying is that you don't necessarily need to have a perfect conception of God within a religion to follow religion. What you need is a better conception than you could have, or maybe a more useful conception than you could have by yourself, right? And I mean, you talk about Christianity and also Judaism, right? And one of the things in it is the story of Moses, where he doesn't see God's face. And I mean, that's a metaphor for the idea that we encounter God, we feel him, but he's also in some ways hidden in both Christianity and in Judaism. I mean, the wind bloweth where it listeth, and you hear the sound thereof, right?
Well, and would you really want a God that you can completely understand?
It wouldn't be God.
It wouldn't be God. It would be smaller than you.
Yeah.
I mean, that's part of what he ends on the Trinity, right? By being 3 in 1, he truly stands as one, because nothing else is like that. You couldn't make that up. That's why that revelation is so unpleasant and amazing at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's something where it is. It's very unsatisfactory, the idea I and my Father are one, but it's also, I mean, it's also true, right? I mean, and somehow it has both, I mean, components there.
If you guys got anything else, I think that might be a good place to end it.
Yeah, I think it is. So thanks for getting on, and hopefully your life hasn't been too stressful, Mark. And I'm glad to hear that Emma's transition seemed to have been going well, and everything with classes. So thanks for getting on, and hopefully it's not 2 to 3 months before we do another one, at least.
Hopefully not.
Hopefully not.
Well,
we're over halfway through now.
Yes, we are. I did think about that today. So
we passed the halfway point.
Yep.
Wow. Wow.
Yep. Got through the first line of the creed and half the book.
Yeah, and then the rest of the book is like, oh yeah, there's other words. I got to deal with that.
Yeah, so, all right. Thanks for everything.